Okay, we've learned pretty much all we need to know about HTML. Let's practice using it. We'll be building a restaurant menu, well, really a food truck menu, but same thing. We're going to do the body first. We won't have any CSS styles yet, so it won't look exactly the same, but that's fine because we'll come back to it during the CSS lessons and start making it prettier then. For now, we only need to think about the HTML part of this web page. And what's the purpose of HTML again? It's for marking up our data and providing structure to it. So this is the food truck menu we're going to build together. We'll see the live version of it in a minute. We're going to start with unstructured data, which is all of the text that goes in the menu, and then we're going to start marking it up together. One last thing I want to mention before we get started on this website. It'd be nice if we could leave some notes to ourselves as we're building it, right? Well, HTML allows you to add comments that will be ignored by the browser. They start with a left arrow, followed by an exclamation point, then 2 dashes. Write whatever note you want after that, then finish off the note with 2 more dashes and a right arrow. Everything inside of those left arrows and right arrows will be ignored. Okay, let's go see the actual web page. Here's the actual web page. Ignore the CSS styling for now. We have plenty of lessons on that later in this unit. I want you to start thinking about how we're going to structure this data. The menu items, their prices, and their descriptions will probably all be nested together inside of an element. The food truck name, logo, and catchphrase at the top of the menu will also probably be grouped together inside of an element. Down at the bottom, we have business info. Do you think that's going to be grouped with the menu items? Probably not. That should be separated into its own group of nested elements. So every time we start building a web page, we need to decide how we're going to mark up our data with HTML first. After we decide on that structure, we can move on to the CSS and start styling it. But we always do the structure first. So let's head over to Replit and start building this page together. Go ahead and make a new REPL. Choose HTML, CSS, and JS as the template. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to name mine Food Truck. Click the Create REPL button. Once it's finished loading, go ahead and delete everything inside of your index.html file. Then, additionally on the side, we have a script.js file. We won't need that for now. Go ahead and delete it. We also have a style.css file. We won't need that for now. Go ahead and delete it. We're going to start completely from scratch with an absolutely empty HTML page. Press the Run button, and you'll see that we have a blank page. Now what? What do we start with at the very top of our HTML? What's that thing that tells the browser to use standard mode instead of the quirks mode? The doc type preamble. So let's go ahead and make one of those. Left arrow, followed by an exclamation point, the word doc type, a space, HTML, and then a right arrow. Now, that's not actually an element. After that, on a new line, what is the root element of all of our HTML documents? Well, it's the HTML element, the one that literally has the letters H, T, M, and L written inside of it. So let's do that together, an H, T, an M, and an L, and it should autocomplete for you at this point. Now, what are the 2 required elements inside of that? The head and the body. Let's go ahead and make the head element, and then after that, go ahead and make the body element. Now, we're going to ignore the head element for now. We'll leave it empty. We're going to focus on the body first. So go ahead and give yourself a space inside of there. The body is where all of the content for our menu is going to go. The text for this menu is on the lesson page where you're watching the video right now. It's completely unstructured, and I did that on purpose. We can imagine that the business owner just told us everything that was going to be on the menu and put us in charge of making the web page for it. Go ahead and copy-paste the text into our HTML file. Now for the tricky part. How are we going to structure this data, and which elements should we use? Well, looking at the data, starting from the beginning, we have a business name and catchphrase. I'm going to group these together as the first section of our web page because our visitors need to know which business they're ordering their lunch from. No HTML yet, just separate them from the rest of the data with a few new lines. Then our visitors need to know their choices for lunch. That would be the main courses and the desserts. So let's separate that text as well with a few new lines. Finally, we're left with the business info. Now we have 3 solid groups of data that we can start marking up and structuring with HTML. And if we flip back over to the finished version to double check, our groups appear to be correct. We have the business name and catchphrase on top, we have the food groupings in the middle, and we have the business info for contacting them down below. Okay, back to Replit, and let's start practicing more of the HTML elements that we learned in our previous lessons. When we demoed a bunch of the most common elements that go in the body, there was one called the div, or the division element. The div element is for generic grouping, so let's use that now. We'll add one div around the first group. Go ahead and move the text inside of that first div. And then another div around the second group of text. Go ahead and cut and paste that text inside of the second div as well, or drag it, up to you. And then a third div for the business information section that's going to go down at the bottom. Go ahead and move your text inside of that div. Next, load our changes by clicking the Run button. And notice that our 3 divs are stacking on top of each other. We have one div along the top, a second div here, and then a third div down here. Okay, back to the top section. Which element do you think we're going to use for the name of the business? I'll give you a hint. It's probably the most important piece of text on this page, right? And whenever we have an important piece of text that describes an entire page or a section of page, we usually use a heading element. In this case, because it's arguably the most important, let's use the H1 element. So go ahead and make a new H1 element, and then move the scorpion on a stick food truck inside of that H1 element. Press the Run button to see your changes, and okay, now we're getting somewhere. Next we have a catchphrase. This catchphrase isn't really important text, just a small entertaining piece of text about the business. You could use one of the other heading elements, an H2 through an H6, but in this case a paragraph element would also work. So let's use a paragraph element because I see some other important text that could use our heading elements down in the middle section. So go ahead and make an opening and closing p tag, and then move your catchphrase inside of that opening and closing tag. Press the Run button. Looks good. That's it for structuring the top section. We'll leave the images out until we do the CSS styling. How about the middle section with all the food prices and choices? Well, I think we have 2 more clear divisions between the main dishes and the desserts. If you take a look at the finished version, we have a main section and a dessert section. So how might we want to group those? If you were thinking div elements, I'd say you're right. Let's go ahead and for now use one div for the mains and a second div for the desserts. Go ahead and grab your mains and move them up into the first div, and then grab your desserts and then move them up into the second div. Now, you can add some spacing here to make it look nicer. That's up to you. Depends on your personal preference. Now that these are separated into 2 sections with divs, the titles for these groups should probably be in heading elements. We already used an H1 element up top, so let's use H2 elements for the mains and the desserts because they both have around the same level of significance. We'll add one H2 to the mains, and then go ahead and move your text inside of there, and one H2 for the desserts, and go ahead and move the title of that section, desserts, inside of there. Press the Run button, and we should see that we have more structure on our page now. Looks good so far. Let's keep going. Now, what do we do about these foods? Let's look at only one of them for the moment, because however we decide to structure it can be reused for all of the others. I'm going to separate out the fried scorpion from everything else, and let's consider this data. We have the name of the food, we have the price, and we have a short description. Use your best judgment here. There's no perfect answer. What I think makes sense is that we definitely need a div around the whole thing. Each of these foods will sit inside of a div. Then for me, at least, it makes sense if both the name of the food and the price are grouped together in a heading element. The reason that I would choose to do that is because occasionally someone is visiting our webpage and using a screen reader. A screen reader is a program that reads web pages aloud for people that are visually impaired and can't see the same as you and I. So by grouping both the name of the food and the price together in an H3, I'm making sure that the screen reader will read both the food name and then the price in that order. You're welcome to make a different decision here if you'd like, but I think this makes sense for now. We'll learn more about making websites accessible for people with screen readers and other impairments in a different lesson. Go ahead and add that H3 now, and move both the name and the price inside of the H3. Finally, let's use a paragraph element for the food description and move that descriptive text inside the paragraph element. Press the Run button, and that looks a little bit better. Not the prettiest styles, but it works for now. Let's go ahead and repeat this process for each of the foods. There's 7 of them in total, 5 main dishes, and 2 desserts. Once we're done, you hopefully know the drill by now. Press the Run button and check out your new structure. Okay. Now for the business information. Mentally, I divide this into 2 separate groups. The address or location of the business, and then the contact information for the business. If you think differently, that's fine. Again, there's no absolute right or wrong way to add markup and structure to your data. You just want to make sure that you're thinking about making your users' lives easier. They should be able to skim your web page and find any information that they need relatively easily. So let's separate the business address from the business contact information with 2 divs. Press the Run button, scroll down. Alright, we've successfully added markup and structure to our data in the body. This was all the data that needed to be directly visible on the web page for our user. In the next lesson, we'll work on the head of our document, which is all the machine-readable info that the browser uses when rendering our web page. If you'd like, at this point, you can start cleaning up your data and moving everything onto nicely spaced lines. It's up to you. I'll do some of that in between these lessons.